The bridge of the Zephyrion flagship, Eternal Dominion, hummed with quiet energy as Commander Veltar stared at the glowing report spread across his command table. His 6 yellow eyes moved slowly across each page, reading the same information. For the 3rd time that day, 3 full solar cycles of watching and waiting had given them everything they needed to know about the humans. "Sir, the final scout reports are in," announced his tactical officer, a thin creature with sharp mandibles that clicked when he spoke. The sound always reminded Veltar of insects, though he would never say so out loud.
Only the humans have exactly
47 combat vessels in their entire fleet. Most of them are converted cargo ships with basic energy weapons. Veltar's secondary hearts beat faster with excitement. 47 ships. The Coalition had brought over 3,000 vessels. To this system, each one larger and more powerful than anything the humans had ever built. This would indeed be the shortest war in galactic history. "What about their ground forces?" Veltar asked, though he already knew the answer. "Primitive projectile weapons, some basic energy shields, and vehicles that still use chemical propulsion." The tactical officer replied with obvious amusement. "Their most advanced fighters cannot even break planetary atmosphere without assistance." Through the massive viewing window, Veltar could see the blue and green world that had caused so much trouble. Earth looked peaceful from this distance, its white clouds swirling lazily around continents that seemed too small to support a spacefaring civilization. Yet somehow, these humans had spread to 17 different worlds in the Outer Rim, claiming territory that belonged to more advanced species. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. He called out the communications officer, her voice cutting through the bridge's low conversations. "We are receiving multiple transmissions from the human colonies. They are requesting immediate military support from their homeworld." Veltar's mandibles curved into what his species considered a smile. "Let them call for help. Their entire fleet could not stop a single one of our battleships." The Coalition had perfected this process over thousands of years. First, they would position their massive fleet just outside the target system, close enough to be seen, but far enough away to avoid any desperate last attacks. Then came the ultimatum, broadcast on every frequency the primitive species used for communication. The message was always the same, delivered in their own language to ensure complete understanding. "Begin the transmission," Veltar ordered. Bridge fell silent as the communication array powered up, its bioorganic components glowing with stored energy. Every ship in the Coalition fleet would broadcast the same message simultaneously, ensuring that every human device capable of receiving signals would hear their words. Veltar stood tall, his forearms spread wide in the traditional gesture of authority. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 millennia of galactic dominance. "People of Earth and the human colonies, I am Commander Veltar of the Zephyrian Coalition. For too long, your species has occupied worlds that do not belong to you. You have built settlements on planets that were claimed by more advanced civilizations long before your kind learned to travel between stars." He paused, letting the words sink in. On 17 different worlds, human families were probably gathering around their communication devices, listening to the voice that would change their lives forever. The Coalition offers you one opportunity to avoid total destruction. You have 72 standard hours to begin evacuating all human settlements beyond your home system. Your people will report to designated processing centers where they will be integrated into Coalition society as a labor class. You will be fed, housed, and given meaningful work under the guidance of your superiors. The terms were generous, really. Most species that resisted the Coalition were simply eliminated, but humans had shown some useful qualities during their brief expansion period. They were hardy, adaptable, and surprisingly good at following orders. Once they understood their place in the galactic hierarchy, your military forces will surrender immediately and without resistance. Any attempt to destroy Coalition property or harm Coalition personnel will result in the complete sterilization of your home system. This offer will not be repeated. Veltar gestured, and the transmission ended. Now came the waiting period, though. It never lasted long. Most species surrendered within 12 hours once they realized the hopelessness of their situation. The smart ones surrendered immediately. "Sir," the tactical officer reported, "we are detecting increased activity around the human colonies. It appears they are attempting to evacuate their civilian populations." "Expected," Veltar replied. "They will want to save as many of their people as possible before accepting our terms. How long until the nearest coalition reinforcements arrive?" "Sir," the tactical officer looked confused. "We brought 3,000 ships. Surely that is sufficient for 47 human vessels." Veltar's laugh was a low rumbling sound that made several junior officers step back nervously. "Of course it is sufficient. But protocol requires us to be prepared for any possibility, no matter how remote." Through the viewing window, Earth continued its slow rotation, unaware that its species' brief moment of independence was about to end. Soon, the humans would join the 16 other species that had learned to accept their place in the natural order of the galaxy. The coalition had spoken. Now they would wait for humanity's inevitable surrender. Captain Heonwoo stood perfectly still in the middle of the cold metal room. His black armor covered every inch of his body, and his face was hidden behind a smooth visor that reflected the bright lights above. Around him, 11 other figures wore identical armor and stood in exactly the same position, it looked like. Statues made of dark metal. The room was completely quiet, except for the soft hum of the space station's air systems. Everything was white and clean, with no decorations or furniture, except for the simple table in the center. The walls were bare metal, and the floor was polished until it shone like a mirror. Suddenly, blue light began to swirl near the far wall. The light grew brighter and started to take shape, forming into tall figures that slowly became solid. "Commander." Veltar appeared first, his 6 yellow eyes blinking as he adjusted to the station's artificial atmosphere. His skin was gray and rough, like old leather, and his forearms moved with careful precision. Behind him came 5 more aliens, each one different from the others. Their biosuits made soft hissing sounds as they adapted to the air mixture, and their various breathing apparatus glowed with soft colors. One had crystal-like skin that reflected the room's lights, while another was covered in what looked like living fur that moved on its own. Commander Veltar stepped forward, his boots clicking on the metal floor. His translator device began to glow, and when he spoke, his words came out in perfect human language. "I am Commander Veltar of the Zephyrian Coalition," he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been refused. "I have come to accept your species' surrender and discuss the terms of your integration into civilized society." The 12 human figures did not move. They stood so still that they might have been machines, their breathing so synchronized that it sounded like one person breathing very slowly. The only sound was the soft whisper of air moving through their armor's filtration systems. Veltar waited for a response, his 6 eyes moving from one figure to another. He had given this same speech to 17 other species, and the reaction was always the same. First came fear, then desperate bargaining, then finally acceptance of the inevitable. These humans were probably too frightened to speak. "Your response time was impressive," Veltar continued, trying to sound generous. "Species take much longer to recognize the wisdom of surrender. Your leaders clearly understand that resistance would only lead to unnecessary suffering." Still, the humans said nothing. Their visors reflected Veltar's image back at him, making it impossible to see their faces or read their expressions. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable, even for the experienced coalition commander. Finally, the 12 figures moved. Not individually, but all at once, like parts of a single machine. They turned their heads toward Veltar. In perfect unison, the movement so precise that it made a soft clicking sound as their armor adjusted. When they spoke, their voices came together as one. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere in the room at once, echoing off the walls and ceiling until it felt like the station itself was speaking. "Greetings, Commander Veltar. I am Captain Heonwoo, speaking for the Terran Defense Council. We have reviewed your proposal." Veltar's secondary hearts began to beat faster. Something was wrong. The voice was completely emotionless, like a computer reading a script. And how could they all speak at exactly the same time without any coordination? Even his own crew could not manage such perfect synchronization. Excellent, Veltar replied, though his confidence was beginning to waver. I am pleased that your species has chosen wisdom over futile resistance. The integration process will begin immediately after we finalize the details. The crystal-skinned alien beside him, Science Officer Cathara, stepped forward nervously. Her advanced sensors were detecting something unusual about the humans, but she could not identify what it was. Their energy signatures were strange, almost like they were not entirely biological. Captain Hyanwu, she said carefully, may we ask about the status of your military forces? Our sensors detect no weapons in this room, but protocol requires us to account for all potential threats. The 12 figures turned to look at her with the same perfect coordination. When they spoke again, their combined voice carried a tone that might have been amusement, though it was impossible to be certain. We are the military forces, Science Officer Cathara. We are the weapons. We are the threat. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Veltar's tactical training told him to retreat, but his diplomatic obligations required him to continue the negotiation. He had faced down the war fleets of dozens of species and never felt this kind of creeping dread. I see, he said slowly. Well, regardless of your military capabilities, the mathematics of this situation are quite clear. The Coalition fleet contains 3,000 vessels, each one more advanced than anything in human space. Surely you understand that resistance is impossible. The figures stood in silence for a long moment, their synchronized breathing the only sound. Then, without warning, they all tilted their heads slightly to the right, like predators studying. Their prey? Terms rejected, they said in unison. The words hit Veltar like a physical blow. In 3,000 years of coalition expansion, no species had ever simply rejected their terms. There were always negotiations, always desperate attempts to bargain for better conditions, but never outright rejection. I beg your pardon, Veltar stammered. Terms rejected, the figures repeated. Initiating alternative diplomatic protocol. The room's lights suddenly changed from white to deep red, and Veltar realized that the game had changed completely. Commander Veltar pressed his back against the cold window, his four hands flat against the smooth surface as he stared in disbelief. At what was happening outside, his mighty flagship, the Eternal Dominion, was dying before his eyes. The ship's living walls, which had pulsed with healthy green light for over 2 centuries, were now flickering with weak yellow sparks before. Going completely dark? My ship, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. What have you done to my ship? The bioneural networks that controlled every system on the Eternal Dominion were shutting down one by one. First, the weapon systems went dark. Then the shields failed. Then the engines stopped their steady humming. It was like watching a living creature slowly die, and Veltar felt each failure like a physical pain in his chest. Captain Hyanwu walked toward him with slow, careful steps. Each footstep made a sharp metallic sound on the station's floor, like a machine counting down to some terrible moment. The black armor reflected the red warning lights that now filled the room, making the figure look like something from a nightmare. We have done nothing, Commander, Captain Hyanwu said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. Your vessel is experiencing a natural response to the electromagnetic field this station generates. Bioneural networks are remarkably fragile when exposed to specific quantum frequencies. Veltar's mind struggled to understand what he was hearing. The Coalition's bioships were the most advanced vessels in the galaxy, their living components, capable of healing damage and adapting to any threat. Nothing should be able to simply turn them off, like switching off a light. Quantum frequencies. Cathara, his science officer, stepped forward despite the fear that made her crystal skin pulse with nervous energy. Her people had studied quantum mechanics for thousands of years, and she knew the limitations of the technology. That's impossible. Quantum manipulation requires technology that wouldn't emerge for another millennium, even for the most advanced species. The figure that called itself Captain Hyanwu turned to look at her. and somehow she could sense amusement in the slight tilt of its head, even though she could not see its face behind the dark visor. "You assume we developed this technology, Cathara, of the 7th crystal matrix? You assume incorrectly? Then how do you have it?" she demanded, her scientific curiosity overcoming her terror. "Quantum field manipulation is theoretical at best. The energy requirements alone would need the output of an entire star system." Another figure stepped forward, identical to the first in every way except for the slight difference in how it held its shoulders. When it spoke, its voice was exactly the same as Captain Haiyan Wu's, as if they were both parts of the same machine. "We took it," the figure said simply, "from the Andromedans who tried to conquer us 70 years ago, just as we took gravitic manipulation from the hegemony, just as we took bioneural integration from the consortium, just as we took quantum tunneling from the collective." Veltar's blood turned to ice in his veins. The names they spoke were legends from ancient history, powerful civilizations that had vanished from the galaxy thousands of years ago. The official records claimed they had destroyed themselves in civil wars or fallen to natural disasters. But no one really knew what had happened to them. "Those civilizations," Veltar said slowly, his voice shaking, "they didn't fall to internal conflicts. They fell to you, fell to themselves." Captain Haiyan Wu corrected, his tone never changing from that terrible calm. "They fell to their assumption that a young species was inherently inferior. They fell to their belief that overwhelming force was the only language the universe understood. They fell to their failure to recognize that humans are remarkably good at learning from their mistakes." Through the window, Veltar could see more coalition ships losing power.
Out there.
Bioneural networks shutting down as the station's invisible field reached out to touch them. The proud vessels that had conquered 17 worlds were now floating helplessly in space, their crews trapped inside vessels that no longer responded to their commands. "You're not human," Cathara whispered, her crystal form flickering with rapid pulses of light. "You can't be. Humans are organic biological creatures. You're something else." "We are human," the figure replied. "We are Captain Hunwu of the 3rd Armored Division who died defending the Titan colonies from the hegemony assault. We are Admiral Soyoung of the Pacific Fleet, who sacrificed her ship to save the civilian evacuation from New Seoul. We are General Dongmin of the Martian Defense Force, who held the line against the collective suicide swarms for 72 hours without reinforcement." As each name was spoken, a different figure stepped forward, but their voices remained perfectly synchronized, as if they were all speaking with the same mouth. "We are the best of humanity," they continued in unison. "Uploaded and enhanced, given bodies that cannot tire, cannot fear, cannot be broken by pain, or threatened by death. We are what remains when diplomacy fails and war becomes inevitable." Veltar sank to his knees, the weight of understanding crushing down on him. The coalition had not encountered a primitive species ready for conquest. They had walked into a trap that had been prepared for centuries, baited with carefully crafted weakness and sprung with overwhelming technological superiority. "How many?" he asked in a broken whisper. "How many what, Commander? How many species have you destroyed this way?" The 12 figures exchanged glances, and for a moment, Veltar thought he detected something like sadness in their synchronized movements. 17, Commander. Same 17 that your intelligence files claim were successfully integrated into your coalition." The terrible truth settled over the room like a blanket of ice. There had been no integrations, no peaceful surrenders, no successful conquests. There had only been the quiet, efficient elimination of threats to human expansion, disguised as diplomatic meetings just like this one, the huge window on the observation deck gave a perfect view of what was happening. To the coalition fleet, Commander Veltar stood with his face pressed against the cold glass, watching his proud warships drift through space like dead fish floating in a pond. The bioships that had conquered 17 worlds were now completely helpless, their living hulls flickering with weak light as their organic systems slowly shut down. The eternal dominion was the worst sight of all. The mighty flagship that had served as Veltar's home for over 50 years was now just a dark shape against the stars, its bioneural network sparking occasionally before going completely silent at the ship's living walls, which had glowed with healthy green energy for centuries, were now as gray and lifeless as old stone. You're wondering if the effect is permanent, Captain Hyanwu said. His voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. He stood behind Veltar, close enough that the commander could hear the soft mechanical sounds coming from inside his armor. It is not. Your ships will recover once they are removed from the field's influence. Your crews will experience no lasting effects beyond temporary disorientation. Veltar turned around slowly, his 6 eyes filled with confusion and fear. Why? He whispered, his voice so quiet that the station's air systems almost covered it completely. Why show mercy to an enemy? 'Cause we are not your enemy, Commander, Captain Hyanwu replied, tilting his head slightly. We are simply the consequence of your actions. Watch. The 12 figures in black armor raised their hands at exactly the same time. Their movements so perfectly coordinated that they looked like one person reflected in multiple mirrors. As their hands came up, something strange began to happen. To the space around the station, the stars started to shimmer and wave, like looking at the bottom of a swimming pool on a hot day. The blackness of space itself seemed to bend and twist, as if reality was made of water and someone had dropped a stone into it. The effects spread outward from the station in all directions, creating ripples that distorted everything they touched. Then, one by one, shapes began to appear where there had been nothing before. First came a single vessel, enormous and dark, its hull so black that it seemed to absorb the light from nearby stars. It materialized slowly, like a photograph developing in slow motion, until it hung in space like a mountain made of metal and shadow. Then another ship appeared, and another, and another. Each one was larger than the biggest coalition battleship, their hulls made of materials that Veltar's eyes could not properly focus on. They seemed to shift and change as he watched, as if they existed in more than 3 dimensions. Within minutes, the entire starfield was filled with human vessels. Hundreds of them, then thousands, all appearing from nowhere, as if they had been hiding in the spaces between reality itself. They arranged themselves in perfect geometric patterns around the helpless coalition fleet, their formations so precise that they looked like living mathematics. The Thanatos-class dreadnoughts, Captain Hyanwu explained. Gesturing toward the nearest group of massive ships were our first serious attempt at void warfare. We built them after studying Andromedan. Gravitational manipulation. Each one can generate localized singularities or manipulate spacetime to create impassable barriers. Veltar's tactical implant was screaming warnings at him, but the information it provided made no sense. Each human vessel was showing energy readings that should have been impossible. Their hulls composed of materials that his sensors could not identify. They moved through space with fluid grace, positioning themselves with the kind of precision that should have required months of planning. Their main weapons, another figure continued, its voice identical to the first, fire streams of converted matter that exist in a state of quantum superposition until they strike their targets. The destructive potential is theoretically unlimited. More ships shimmered into view, these ones smaller but somehow more frightening. Their hulls seemed to absorb light itself, making them appear as dark holes cut out of the starfield. Moved like living shadows, flowing from one position to another without any visible means of propulsion. The Nemesis-class stealth frigates, a third figure explained. Incorporated technology we learned from the collective's phase-shifting capabilities. They can exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, making them effectively impossible to target with conventional weapons. Cathara, the crystalline science officer, pointed with a trembling appendage toward massive constructs that seemed to be made of pure energy. They pulsed with inner light, their forms constantly shifting between different geometric shapes. What are those? She asked, her voice barely audible. The Apocalypse-class siege platforms, came the reply from yet another identical figure. They were designed using principles we extracted from hegemony bioneural networks. Each one contains the uploaded consciousness of an entire military academy, allowing them to coordinate fleet movements with perfect precision. Veltar's mind reeled as he tried to count the vessels surrounding his disabled fleet. There were thousands of them, each one representing technology that should not have existed for another millennium. The coalition had brought 3,000 ships to intimidate 47 human vessels, only to discover that humanity had been hiding an armada that dwarfed anything in galactic history. "How many ships do you have?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Enough," came the simple reply. One of the Coalition's scout vessels, full to swift judgment, had been trying to break free from the electromagnetic field by overloading its bioneural cortex. The small ship's organic systems were burning themselves out in a desperate attempt to restore power. And for a moment, it looked like the gambit might work. "Swift judgment is attempting to escape," Captain Hyenwu observed, with detached interest. "Admiral So-young, please demonstrate appropriate diplomatic response." The figure identified as Admiral So-young stepped forward, her movements flowing like water. She did not speak, did not gesture, did not even appear to communicate with the human fleet in any visible way. She simply stood there, perfectly still, for exactly 3 seconds. Then the swift judgment ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no flash of light, no debris field. The ship simply was not there anymore, as if it had never been built in the first place. The space it had occupied was perfectly empty, without even a trace of radiation to mark its passing. "Quantum dissolution," Admiral So-young explained, her voice carrying the same emotionless tone as all the others. "The target's molecular structure is convinced to forget its current configuration. Very clean, very efficient, very final." Veltar stared at the empty space where one of his ships had been, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. This was not just overwhelming technological superiority. This was the casual manipulation of reality itself, delivered without malice or ceremony, through the viewport. The human fleet maintained its perfect formations, each vessel a demonstration of impossible technology. The Coalition had come to dictate terms to a primitive species, only to find themselves in the presence of gods. The main meeting room of the space station had been changed into something that looked like a courtroom. The 12 figures in black armor stood in a straight line, like judges ready to pass sentence on criminals. Commander Veltar and his delegation sat in simple metal chairs facing them, looking very much like prisoners waiting to hear their fate. Veltar had spent the last few hours staring out the windows at his helpless fleet, watching his mighty warships drift through space like broken toys. The sight had broken something inside him, and now he sat slumped in his chair, his forearms hanging loosely at his sides. Captain Hyenwu stood in the center of the formation, perfectly straight and still. Suddenly a small device appeared, in his hands, materializing out of thin air like magic. The tablet glowed with soft blue light and displayed information that scrolled past too quickly for Veltar to read. "The Terran Defense Council has reviewed the Coalition's expansion protocols," Captain Hyenwu announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Finds them to be in violation of several fundamental principles of galactic civilization." Veltar's head snapped up, his 6 eyes blazing with sudden anger. "Violation?" he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We are the galactic civilization. We have maintained order for over 3 millennia. One of the other figures stepped forward, moving with the same mechanical precision as the others. "You have maintained dominance," Admiral So-young said, her voice carrying a tone of cold judgment. "Order implies justice, mutual benefit, and the protection of the weak. Your system provides none of these. It is a pyramid of exploitation that requires constant expansion to maintain stability." The words hit Veltar like physical blows. For 3,000 years, the Coalition had brought peace to the galaxy by ensuring that strong species ruled over weak ones. It was natural law, the way the universe was supposed to work. How could these humans claim it was wrong? Another figure moved forward, his armor reflecting the harsh lights of the chamber. "The Coalition will withdraw all forces from occupied territories within 1 standard year," General Dongmin declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. "All subjugated species will be granted immediate independence and provided with sufficient resources to establish sustainable governments." "Impossible," Cathara said, her crystal form pulsing with agitation. "The Coalition economy depends on resource extraction from client worlds. Tribute. Our core systems would collapse within decades." "Then your core systems were never sustainable," Captain Hyenwu replied without emotion. "True civilization builds upward, not outward. It creates abundance, not scarcity. It seeks to elevate all species, not to exploit them. The tablet in. His hands projected a three-dimensional map of the galaxy above their heads. Red zones marked coalition territory, stretching across nearly a quarter of all known space. As they watched, the red areas began to change color, transforming into a patchwork of different hues representing independent worlds. The new galactic order will operate under the principle of voluntary association, Captain Hyanwu continued. No species will be compelled to join any political entity against their will. No world will be stripped of resources without fair compensation. No civilization will be permitted to maintain order through the threat of annihilation. Veltar stared at the holographic display, watching centuries of coalition expansion being erased in moments. And who will enforce these principles? He demanded, his diplomatic training finally reasserting itself. Who will maintain order when the strong inevitably prey upon the weak? The 12 figures exchanged glances, and Veltar could swear he detected satisfaction in their synchronized movements. The Terran Defense Council will serve as guarantor of galactic peace, they replied in perfect unison. We will maintain monitoring stations throughout known space and respond to any attempts to recreate the Coalition's expansion model. You're establishing a human empire, Veltar accused, his voice rising with desperate anger. You're simply replacing our dominance with your own. No, Captain Hyanwu replied, and for the first time his voice carried something that might have been sadness. We are establishing a human commitment. Every world that chooses peace will be protected. Every species that seeks development will be assisted. Every civilization that respects the rights of others will be free to pursue their own destiny. The holographic display changed again, showing trade routes and communication networks spreading across the galaxy like a vast web. But instead of the pyramid structure that had defined the coalition, this network was flat and distributed with no single point of control. The 17 species you believed conquered, General Dongman explained, have been developing their own technologies and cultures in protected space for the past several centuries. They will emerge as full participants in the new galactic community, contributing their unique perspectives and capabilities to the common good. Veltar felt his world crumbling around him. Everything he had believed about galactic civilization, everything the Coalition had built over 3 millennia, was being swept away by these emotionless figures in black armor. And if we refuse, he asked, his voice barely a whisper, then you will be removed from the equation. Admiral Soyoung replied with clinical detachment. Your populations will be relocated to worlds where they can pursue peaceful development. Your military capabilities will be dissolved. Your government will be restructured or eliminated as circumstances require. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of the station's systems. Through the windows, the human fleet maintained its perfect formations, each vessel a reminder of the technological gap that made resistance impossible. How long do we have to decide? Veltar asked. The decision has already been made, Captain, Hyanwu replied. What remains is only the choice of how to implement it. You can cooperate with the transition and maintain some degree of autonomy, or you can resist and be processed like the previous 17 species. The tablet dissolved back into nothingness, leaving the chamber in stark silence. Veltar looked at his delegation, seeing his own despair reflected in their faces. The Coalition had spent 3,000 years building an empire based on superior force, only to discover that force was a tool that could be taken away by someone with better technology and clearer purpose. We accept your terms, he whispered. The age of the Coalition was over. The age of humanity's peace had begun.